Welcome and thank you for joining us for this journal club on the role of patient-reported outcomes and medication adherence assessment in patient-focused drug development for solid organ transplantation. This journal club is a collaboration of the AST, Advanced Practice Providers, and Transplant Pharmacy Communities of Practice. Before we begin the main presentation, we have a few housekeeping notes to help you engage with today's presentation. There is currently a viewership polling question displayed for the audience. Please take a moment to answer this question while we finish the remaining announcements. This journal club is being recorded and we will have the archive available on the APCOP and TxPharm hubs and on AST's YouTube channel. Please note that all your lines have been muted so that only the presenters can be heard for the archived recording. If you do have a question for our panelists during the journal club, we encourage you to participate by using the questions or Q&A section in the Zoom webinar panel to submit your questions for consideration. If you do submit your questions in the chat section, they may be missed during the presentation. Finally, when you log off at the conclusion of today's journal club, you will see a link to a brief survey to complete. Please fill out this survey to help us keep our content current and engaging. I will now turn the session over to one of our moderators, Gina Jamero, to begin our presentation.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our journal club. I am Gina Jamero. I am the lead nurse practitioner at Cedars Sinai Medical Center for heart transplant and mechanical circulatory support cardiology. I will be one of your moderators, along with Abbie Leino, who is a transplant pharmacist who is working on her PhD at the University of Michigan. We would like to ask that all your questions be held until the end of the presentation. And I'm really excited to talk about our topic today related to our articles regarding patient-reported outcomes. And today we have, as our speaker and presenter of these articles, Rita Alloway, PharmD. Rita is a research professor in the College of Medicine at the University of Cincinnati and director of transplant clinical research. She also serves as director of the Transplant Pharmacy Residency and Fellowship since 1994, where she has trained over 30 pharmacy residents and fellows in solid organ transplantation with a focus on clinical research. Her clinical research in transplantation has generated over 200 peer-reviewed publications and over 150 invited lectures to present specific research results and overviews of transplant immunosuppression. Everyone, please welcome our presenter for today, Rita Alloway.
Thank you guys for that kind introduction. As been expressed today, we're really going to focus on two articles that have been published relatively recently, focusing on patient-reported outcomes. This is not a typical journal club, as when you're talking about study results and various interventions. This is more of two journal clubs that really focus on a new topic to some maybe, but that is becoming very, very relevant in transplantation. And because of these two articles that we're focusing on, the topic in the presentation tends to have more of a regulatory slant to it. However, we can discuss the impacts on clinical care when we lead into the question and answer period. So thank you for joining. So the conflicts of interest that are disclosed here are essentially my financial relationships that I'm required to report through AST. But the real most important conflict of interest or disclosure that I should make here is I am not and do not consider myself a PRO scientist. These are very unique people who have been trained in the development of PROs and PRO measures that I think we are indebted to within the transplant community as we attempt to move forward and bring these to the day-to-day activities within transplantation. So the objective of our talk today is really to review the regulatory information on patient-reported outcomes, PROs, and patient-reported outcome measures in solid organ transplantation. The two articles that we'll be summarizing today are one that was published recently in 2022 with a focus on the efforts that have been made through the European medicine agencies, and then a publication from 2021 with the various follow-ups that we've had with the Food and Drug Administration here in the US. So basically, in introduction, patient-reported outcomes assess the individual's perception of life participation, medication adherence, disease symptoms, and therapy side effects that are extremely relevant in the context of transplantation. PROs can potentially be suitable as primary, secondary, or tertiary endpoints, but there is a lot of validation that must surround those before and qualification before they can be incorporated into randomized clinical trials as such endpoints. PRO measures, or PROMs, are what actually facilitate our assessment of the patient's perspective of their health. But the endpoint must be, again, like I said, developed and validated. So you're going to hear me focus a lot. It's very important to differentiate here that this is the patient's perspective, and we'll focus on this as we go on through. In the US, as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, the FDA describes what's called patient-focused drug development and calls it and defines it as a systemic approach to help us ensure that patient experiences, their perspectives, their needs and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into the drug development and evaluation process. And in the European Society of Organ Transplant has actually submitted a request to their EMA for broad scientific advice on clinical trial design and endpoints in kidney transplant as it relates to PROs and PROMs. And the purpose of their publication was to share the advice that they had received, which is wonderful. Now, just as a bit of background, I want to really focus on the two groups of people that are primarily doing the work in this area. And if you're not interested in this, if you're not knowledgeable of this, or if you have interest in this, I really want to encourage you to focus on these groups' work. Throughout this presentation, I've included as many website addresses and publications as I can to familiarize yourself with their work, if you're not already. So SONG Transplant is a standardized outcomes in nephrology, specifically focusing on kidney transplant initiative. And it was initiated in 2015 to develop core outcomes domains in kidney transplantation that we felt were important. And if you look at the graphic to the right, you can see their core outcomes, which were deemed to be critically important to all stakeholder groups and should be reported in trials focused on graft health, cardiovascular disease, cancer, infection, life participation, and mortality. And basically, you can see here that they established one of their primary core measures and outcomes is life participation, and have subsequently published consensus workshop reports on this process. In the US, the Critical Path Institute of Transplant Therapeutic Consortium, TTC, again, you can see the link to their web address, was initiated in 2017. And they identified similar goals that focused on areas that may hinder new product development and transplantation, focused on the potential of developing biomarkers, endpoints in process improvement, and really attempt to define appropriate regulatory pathways to achieve the endorsements of solutions that they found. And currently, the two main focus areas that they've identified are biomarkers or endpoints for determining efficacy of new therapies and tools to assess safety and tolerability. And when you look at this, one of their summaries of drug safety and tolerability is to continue to consider the framework for the development of PRO measures for future drug development. And their position statement that was reported in this publication talked about rational and planned approaches to develop new tools to assess drug safety and tolerability therapies in transplantation, again, with the goal to facilitate novel therapy development in transplantation. So patient-reported outcomes as an endpoint of clinical trials is very important potential to allow us advancement. A PRO is described as information that's assessed and reported, again, I want to emphasize, directly by the individual, and assesses how they feel or function in relation to their health or their treatment without, it's important to understand, without the interpretation or modification of anyone else, including clinicians or researchers, etc. PROs can be primary, co-primary, secondary, or exploratory endpoints, but they must be accompanied by validated PRO measures. PROs are frequently now included in kidney transplant trials. All of us that do clinical research recognize the quality of life assessments and different things that are completed, but unfortunately the results are infrequently reported in the medical literature. Also, there's a heterogeneity of choice of the PRO measures that make the interventions and the comparisons of these interventions difficult. And also the PROMs may not be validated in transplant recipients. They could be validated in other populations, but they're not validated in transplant recipients, thus not qualifying them for regulatory use. So it is important that we begin to look about including PROs in randomized controlled trials. And this is based on a consensus of transplant recipients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals. And they talked about the following PROs that could be considered. First is live participation. And in the publication by the Song Transplant Group, they define live participation as the ability to participate in activities that give patients a sense of fulfillment, enjoyment, control, and hope in their lives. As they began to focus on medication adherence, they broke medication adherence down to 3 phases: initiation, implementation, and discontinuation. With initiation being whether the patient takes the first prescribed dose, implementation being the extent to which a patient's actual dosing corresponds to the prescribed regimen, and discontinuation when no more doses of the drug are being taken. So what are the concerns that are associated with non-adherence? We all know that medication non-adherence is a major concern in solid organ transplant due to the complex regimens for not only immunosuppression that we administer to the patients, but also treatment of their comorbid conditions. Kidney transplant patients are most vulnerable to the classification of medication non-adherence called the implementation problems, and are more frequently diagnosed than really treatment discontinuation or treatment implementation. And unfortunately, over 1/3 of our patients struggle to implement the immunosuppressive regimens as prescribed. What are the problems really that we see that are associated with assessing adherence? In randomized clinical trials, as we know, it's essential to know the level of adherence to support the results that we have. The FDA actually recommends identifying and selecting transplant candidates that are likely to adhere. I think we all kind of laugh when we think about that, because the patient that comes in for a workup is a very different patient and has different priorities than after they're transplanted. But we always want to focus on a patient who's going to maximize their adherence. And the EMA describes that requires a description to monitor adherence and consider adherence when quantifying treatment effects. But despite regulatory guidance, adherence is rarely given prominence in our randomized clinical trials. So when we start talking about patient symptoms and side effects, transplant patients are concerned about the number and the burden of the side effects that are associated with their immunosuppression. Randomized clinical trials assess side effect by adverse event checklist by the provider. So typically when a patient comes in, similar to what we do in clinical practice, we're basically checking off a list if the patient has an adverse event or not. It's very difficult for us to ascertain, is this side effect getting worse or better? And really, how problematic is it to the patient? And that's what we're hoping PRO measures will allow us to do. In kidney transplant randomized controlled trials, there are adverse events inadequacy. There may be selective reporting, poor definition or description of the measurements that we're using, lack of alignment with the known and common side effects, and therefore really the true burden of immunosuppression is underestimated in terms of the adverse event or the overall distress that it provides to the patient. And also it is recommended that patient-reported symptoms and side effects represent a meaningful primary secondary endpoint for randomized controlled trials in kidney transplants. So how do we do this? We basically should select an appropriate patient-reported outcome measure, okay? And basically, a PROM should consider the prevalence and nature of the condition that we're attempting to assess. It should look at the characteristics that are relevant or unique to the patient population. And the patient's perspectives and priorities should be of the utmost concern. And the outcomes that might be expected to change in response to the intervention is hopefully the difference that a PROM will provide us different from just a checklist to assess an adverse event. There are a variety of PROM categories, the generic health status measures that we're familiar with, conditions or symptom specific measures that are associated not only with kidney disease, but also with medication side effects that are associated with immunosuppressive regimens, but also the preference or utility measures that assess the value that's assigned to the overall health state that the patient actually describes themselves as having. Core PROMs have been identified for kidney disease and oncology, but we have to be able to translate these, especially for kidney disease, to transplantation. So the recommendations from the publication from the Song Initiative basically said that they recommended the live participation PROM as being the Promise SF version 2.0. And again, this is the website here if you would like to look up and the specific details about this. But what they discussed about this PROM is its ability to participate it measures the ability of the recipients to participate in social roles and activities. It's available in 30 languages. It's validated, and it has very robust cytometric validation to strengthen the reported results. When they focused on medication adherence, their recommendation was to focus on the BASIS measure. Again, this is the BASIS website, so you could go there and see the qualifications and the specifics of the BASIS medication adherence assessment. But there's another group, Commit, that I just wanted to include in here, and because I love their terminology. They recommend that a measurement of medication adherence should be seen in the future as the 5th vital sign of a patient. And I think that we can all assess how important that is specifically to transplantation. They go on to recommend that smart technology, whether using video or photo assessments or drug intake, or very elaborate electronic detection, packaging, etc., should be utilized, but self-report should be incorporated in all randomized clinical trials. So as it relates to symptoms or side effect, this group really said that no single instrument was recommended, but instruments to measure should be used to measure the impact should be selected based upon the criteria reliability, validity, and responsiveness to change. The instrument should be chosen based upon the RCT with aims and the types of intervention. And they gave some examples. So gastrointestinal toxicity, the quality of life index, if you're wanting to measure GI toxicity. And then if you're looking at the measures for patients with kidney disease, you can look at this quality of life measure of side effects for related with chronic kidney disease. But it's important to keep in mind that if you're looking at a regimen that improves GI toxicity and you want to incorporate this type of PROM into it, the FDA or other regulatory agencies are going to ask you, said, okay, you may be decreasing GI toxicity and measuring that, but they want to know, are you making another toxicity worse with the changes in your intervention? So it becomes very tricky of which of these that you're able to select. So the recommendations from this group were that the PROM selection requires appropriateness, reliability, validity, acceptability, and feasibility without excess burden of the patients to complete these forms and fill them out on an ongoing basis where we can see trends that are happening with the outcomes. They also said that there should be transparent result reporting for all of the PROs that are measured. Right now, they say that PROs are suitable for secondary endpoints for interventional trials and transplantation, but did not go as far as making a comment about primary endpoints. Electronic adherence monitoring is advised. They recommended the SPIRIT PRO for reporting study protocols and the CONSORT PRO for reporting randomized clinical trials results. So physical, emotional, and cognitive function, mental health, and health-related quality of life should always be considered. So the beauty of what this group did is they basically presented this packet to the medicinal products for human use at the EMA and basically asked for their scientific advice and received a response back, which is very important first step. The EMA basically said that PROMs are important to capture, but they said that data is difficult to assess. They did provide recommendations to establish a core set of outcomes, but they didn't say what those were. They supported health-related quality of life and PROs as important, however, as secondary endpoints. Using as a primary endpoint is going to require additional work. They did say that the SPIRIT PRO and the CONSORT PRO was acceptable, and medication adherence should be measured, but recognizes that the extrapolation of adherence from those participating in a randomized clinical trial to real life is going to be difficult. But this is a huge first step that they were able to achieve in terms of getting some advice back from the agencies of how to proceed. And then moving on to the next article and some of the FDA workshops that have been occurring in the US. There was one that occurred in 2017, and this is the publication from this again, where the FDA had a public meeting focused on patient-focused drug development and medication adherence, and basically used a consensus panel of a group of experts, but also the real focus was on getting the patient's voice, and those results have been published. And then the second one that occurred in 2020 with the results that were published in May of 21. And really, it was focused on what are the impact of PROMs and medication adherence on patient-focused drug development for solid organ transplantation. And it basically recognizes that the challenges for individuals living with a transplant and managing complex treatment regimens and treatment-related side effects are difficult, and that we do need to establish a validated set of PROMs in transplantation to better reflect patient preferences when evaluating the risk-benefit profile of novel therapies and product development and regulatory decision-making. And also the strategies to develop the PROMs for symptom assessment in transplantation, potentially through previously established tools or adapting PROMs for other therapeutic areas, may be a way to get the ball rolling a little bit quicker for this in transplantation. They did agree that the challenges with medication adherence in solid organ transplantation and the strategies to improve medication adherence in clinical trials will hopefully improve the validity and the interpretability of study results. So again, this public workshop again provided by the FDA and stakeholders, an opportunity to hear the patients discuss their experiences in managing their post-transplant regimens. And basically the patients really focus their insights on 4 different areas: the intersection of chronic care management and their management of immunosuppression and their new disease of immunosuppression, as I like to refer to it. Also, the disease-related symptoms from their comorbid conditions and potentially end-stage renal disease, medication-related side effects, and the concerns that they had with medication adherence. And I remember very vividly, and it really struck home with me, the patients are like, okay, do I need to be 50%, 75%, 100% adherent? And that was really a question of what the panel, couldn't answer. We focused on telling the patients to be 100% adherent, but, and that's what we base our results on, and that's what we hope for, when in reality, we know that that's unlikely the case. So patient-focused drug development includes techniques to minimize the burden of a patient's actual participation in the clinical trials, capture the patient preference, and use patient and caregiver input to inform drug development. So the techniques or examples that they use for this are called clinical outcome assessments, COAs. And in the FDA, they use a little different terminology, but they talk about these development tools that help interpret how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And those are 3 particular words that you'll hear in the US side coming back over and over. How does a patient feel, function, and survive? PROMs are an example of a clinical outcome assessment, but they must be validated. But the FDA does provide 4 guidance documents to incorporate the patient voice. Again, this is a link to the website, and these are what the 4 guidelines documents focus on: collecting comprehensive and representative input from a variety of patient voices and caregivers. What are the methods to identify what's important to the patients? How do you select, develop, and modify a fit for purpose clinical outcome assessment? And how do you incorporate COAs as endpoints to support regulatory decision making? So this is a figure for this paper, and I know it's kind of busy, but I'm going to take the time to just read through this, because I think it's important to continue to wrap our head around understanding the science of patient-reported outcome measures and what we need to do to validate them, qualify them, and be able to use them and for regulatory purposes. So first, we have to identify the context of use and the concept of interest. So identify the concept of interest in the context of use, which means in the specific disease and target population that we're studying for hopefully using to submit with the intended application for drug approval or endpoint positioning. Obviously, we need to perform literature research and have expert review and document the contents of use and the context of interest. And then ask yourself the question, is there an existing measure that is fit for purpose or do we need to develop a new PRO measure in this space? So basically consider resources to leverage existing literature and data to select appropriate instrument. Is the PO measure that exists currently fit for purpose as it is? In other words, will it work in a transplant-related population? Does the PRO measure that exists need to be modified? If so, how? And then if there are no existing measures for planned context of use, can we develop a new PRO measure? Now, if you're thinking from the perspective of a drug development company, you're going to sit there and say, okay, do I really need to develop a plan for a PRO measure in the context of developing my plan for submitting to the regulatory authorities for approval? But these are some of the things that have to be considered when we're starting to attempt to include these in as secondary or tertiary endpoints. Then we need to select or develop or modify the PRO measure. We have to obtain patient input and concept elicitation. We need to design and write review items or questions. We need to have a recall period for responses and options and format. We have to conduct cognitive interviews to ensure the interpretation and understanding of these instrument questions, select a method for data collection, potentially explore language translation, scoring algorithms, pilot drafts of PRO measures, and document content validity. This is how you can see that the group from the Song Initiative has really gone ahead and incorporated a lot of these in and has some of this background done to recommend specific PROs. And then you have to evaluate the PRO measurement and score its interpretation. Is the score reliable, and is the construct valid with psychometric testing? Can you test and retest the reliability and show that reliability is seen throughout the process? Can you confirm your scoring algorithm? Is your algorithm similar across a variety of PROs? Can you assess whether the PRO measures can detect change? That's the beauty of a PRO. It can show us if not only that a symptom occurs, yes or no, but it can show us if the symptom is getting worse or getting better. Again, to reiterate that, the PRO measure must be sensitive to gains and losses in the measurement concept and change across the entire range expected to a target population. And one of the things that you struggle with a PRO measure is when you think, well, you know, a year post-transplant, is the patient just getting used to this side effect? They've learned to tolerate, they've learned to live with it. So maybe the significance of this effect is decreasing over time. And that's important things to understand. Also ensure that the PRO measure has appropriate thresholds that constitute a clinically meaningful within patient change in scores in your target population. Obviously create a user manual and establish administrative procedures and training manuals. So when you submit this as fit for purpose to a regulatory structure, you basically have to define the qualification is the conclusion that within the context of use, the drug development tool that you've selected can be relied upon to have specific interpretation and application in drug development. And it describes the way this drug development tool will be used and the purpose it's going to use. So you have a letter of intent, you have a qualification plan, and then you submit a full qualification package to the agency for incorporation. So this is something that is near and dear to my heart, but I'm afraid that I'm going to have to let go of this dream. But there's a focus of adapting PROMs for use in drug development for solid organ transplant. And basically there is a lot of time and resources that are required to develop novel PROMs that are substantial. And think about developing those for each individual adverse event that our transplant patients may experience. NCI has actually invested a lot of money in various RFAs that have developed patient-reported outcomes that are in conjunction with their common terminology criteria for adverse events. So it's called the PRO CTCAE. The thing that I like to focus on is the CTCAE was developed in oncology trials, but as you know, this is what's now been adopted for all clinical trials that occur to basically provide a similar nomenclature for rating these adverse events across all types of clinical trials, even outside of transplantation, outside of oncology, excuse me. So the question that I have is, okay, they're putting all this effort and energy into this. Could a PRO CTCAE be incorporated into a solid organ transplant randomized controlled trial? So the examples that they're focusing on validating right now are fatigue, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and constipation, of which I think we all know are common symptoms that occur in our transplant patients. And I think specifically the GI toxicities are some that we struggle with a lot with our current standard of care regimens. But when I have raised these questions and attempted to apply this as fit for purpose, I've basically been told that these have not been validated in the target population that we're studying. Therefore, at least at this time, we can't use them. But I'm hopeful that there's a lot of people out there smarter and younger than me that will be able to push this ball down the field a little bit more. So when you focus on medication adherence, we all know that medication non-adherence negatively impacts the validity and accuracy of clinical studies by lowering the overall study power, increasing the variance, and decreasing the magnitude of the visible treatment effects that we have. Also, when we think about crossover between various intervention regimens within a trial, it's something that we need to consider. There are certain things called clinical trial simulation, CTS tools, that are basically models that describe a disease progression, expected drug effects, placebo effects, dropout rates, and trial design effects that hopefully will be able to improve our efficiency in study designs, and that will allow us to potentially minimize some of the design trial aspects, and also potentially this design and duration while maintaining an adequate study power to characterize drug effects. So think about this in the context. Could we use clinical trial simulation for a control group of, say, TAC, MMF, and prednisone in a kidney transplant population to be able to predict the long-term follow-up without having to have a simultaneous ongoing control group for every study that we attempt to introduce? And basically, clinical trial simulation tools could be developed to incorporate medication adherence. Again, back to what we said before. What if the patient is 50%, 75, 85% adherent, 100% adherent? How would that impact our overall trial outcome and design? So from regulatory aspects right now, at least from the FDA, which I can speak most comfortably about, their focus is safety right now in kidney outcomes and non-inferiority, or basically no worse than. Our standard of care, tacrolimus, MMF, and prednisone, has such good results, at least in our current endpoints that we measure, the combinatorial endpoint of biopsy-proven acute rejection, patient graft survival, and loss to follow-up, that it's very difficult for us to improve on that. So we have non-inferiority margins as it relates to that outcome. However, can we incorporate other secondary or tertiary endpoints that focus more on safety, or really define the patient's perspective of safety better than what we currently have to improve our drug approval process? Could this process of developing these novel therapies in transplantation again be enhanced by secondary claims supported by PROMs? And can the patient's voice actually address in a more detailed differences in this safety? Again, can they show us when the adverse events are getting better or worse, that it impacts their life less or more? And give us a more definitive aspect on how to assess these safety endpoints. So I wanted just to end up this with just thinking about what's the real world impact and questions that you would ask stakeholders. So basically, one of the first questions that I propose focuses on not only a side effect, but then also adherence. So if two products were equal in efficacy and toxicity, but one product included a PROM that supported decreased tremors, the question would be, would you prescribe the product with reduced tremors based upon the PROM result? And I think really more of the real world impact would be, could the product with a PROM reducing tremors have an increased value to the various stakeholders that we are accustomed to dealing with in transplantation? And then lastly, if two products were equal in efficacy and toxicity, but one product included a PROM that supported improved adherence, would you prescribe the product with improved adherence based upon a PROM? And could the product with a PROM show improved adherence have an increased value to the various stakeholders? So that's kind of where in drug development, the rubber kind of meets the road, if for lack of a better term, in terms of incorporating these into the regulatory process. So I'd like to thank you guys for your participation in this, and would like to open up the floor for questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alloway, for the excellent presentation and sharing your expertise with us. While we give the audience a few minutes to type in their questions, I'll kick off our Q&A by asking you for your thoughts about how can we expand PROs from this drug development space into clinical practice? Because I think most of us on this call, that's where we live our day-to-day lives.
No, you're exactly right. I think that the limitations of PROs in clinical practice will be similar to what they are from a limitation purpose. We need for a drug development purpose. In terms of, is this a validated measure? Is it easy for the patient to use and make an assessment? How do we get that information back to the care provider in a way in which it is useful and it is acted upon? You know, we discussed a few of these questions early, and it made me reflect back on some of my experiences in drug development. I remember in drug development when we have had drugs that were at non-inferior or no worse than, and yet I had to go to a patient and tell them, okay, you know, this drug's no longer going to be available to you because they're not developing this drug, so we need to switch you to standard of care. And obviously, you know, they're upset about that at that point in time because those are the patients that are doing well. But I remember the contrast between this one particular instance and the side effects that the patient was describing. The side effects were very dramatic that they experienced with the new combination in terms of worsening of their GI toxicities and different things like that. And it didn't take a PRO or a PROM to assess and quantitate that in clinical practice. But there was really nothing that we could do at that point in time, and made it very frustrating. The second thing that I've experienced in the drug development world now, as we've incorporated some of the PROMs, is basically the regulatory agencies are now looking at saying, okay, you bring your patients in for study assessments and you're assessing the adverse events, but you're also giving these patients a PRO measure, and they're making assessments of adverse events on this as well. Are those adverse events that are collected on the PROM being incorporated into the overall adverse event profile of the drug that's in development? And that's a new thing that we need to consider in how we're going to incorporate that in. But, you know, I would welcome comments from the audience in terms of incorporating these type of measures into their clinical practices.
So,
Awesome, thank
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Gina. I just didn't see you there. Ask the question.
Oh, we have a question from the audience. Is there a limitation of getting impactful PROs when patients are comparing life on dialysis versus life post-transplant? Meaning all would report a positive QOL with a transplant compared to dialysis.
That's so insightful. And whoever asked that question hit the nail on the head. First off, there's such a dramatic improvement, as we all know, when patients stop dialysis and receive a transplant, that it makes it very difficult to assess differences in results based upon an intervention, because the change from baseline to, say, your first measurement is so dramatic, and it's not related to your intervention at all. It's related to the person getting a transplant. And so that's very, very important. And that makes it very difficult to find these tools that are sensitive enough to differentiate the effects of the intervention versus the effects of the transplant. And that's very, very important. I so appreciate you bringing that up. The other focus is in some disease states, like say Crohn's disease or different things like that, as your disease progression gets worse, we have relatively good PRO measures that can quantify that for us, but almost renal failure and kidney disease to some extent, our disease state is relatively asymptomatic until you get a very, very low serum creatinine or creatinine clearance. So there's not really a marker of disease progression post-kidney transplant that's going to be able to differentiate a creatinine clearance of, say, 75 versus 45, even though that would be hugely clinically significant. But just those are some of the things that have to be incorporated in as we consider this.
All right, our next question from the audience is excellent presentation, such an important topic. Do you anticipate a significant burden to study participants with incorporating PROs in clinical trials? Would this impair enrollment, in your opinion?
Oh me, whoever is out there has been walking in my shoes. So yes, it is difficult to get the patients to take their time and focus on completing those, especially right now when the ones that at least I have used are very, very long. They're typically paper. We try to, and even if you put them in a tablet format, we attempt to give them to the patients, while they're waiting in clinic to be seen. But I think the wave of the future is minimizing your number of questions as much as you can. But I think you're always going to lose something when you do that. But we're going to have to minimize the questions. Number two, we're going to have to attempt to find the easiest way possible to get the patients to complete these and complete them in a good way. And yes, those are difficult. Those are real world problems with this.
Okay, another question we have is when assessing ADEs, I'm not sure if that's activities.
Adverse drug effects.
Oh, adverse drug effects. It's important to understand which ones impact quality of life in which patients. It depends on the goals that patients have set after transplant, i.e. work, raising children, socializing with friends, travel, physical and mental activities. The ADE questions, oops, sorry, the screen moved on me. The ADE questions we ask as HCPs doesn't take that into consideration. And I think that's what the whole idea of the pros are, is to really look at everything.
No, but that's good. That's good insight. Some of the more detailed pros, especially that look at quality of life, are able to give you an overall assessment of that. But just think about it in today's world. Yes, tremors are a side effect of tacrolimus, but that becomes a lot more relevant to a dentist, a photographer, a transplant surgeon. You know what I'm saying, in terms of how it affects their daily activities. However, if you're comparing that to maybe a Bella regimen, a stay-at-home mom that doesn't have any childcare and maybe a hurricane's coming through, like in Florida, how do they cope with going somewhere to get a monthly infusion and have that available? And how does that impact their ability to participate in life? And so I think that the example that I just give you is a good example to understand that you have to balance the pros and cons of each intervention. You can't just look at tremors. You can't just look at adherence. You have to look at the overall process. And that's really what the PROs are focusing on.
So our next question is, would a PRO registry like post-transplant, like it's done in rare diseases, as a natural history of the burden of transplant of immunosuppression for patients be beneficial?
I think that I would say yes. Obviously it's going to take somebody putting the regulatory focus into it that is going to make it a useful tool, post the data useful on the backside, either to a regulatory authority or a insurance provider. If we're going to try to justify somebody paying more for a certain medication, it's just going to have to be organized in a way that we're able to sustain a benefit from it. But yes, I think that's a wonderful idea. And like you said, it's been done in rare diseases. And I think the point that I want to make here is, unfortunately, the transplant population really has had a relatively silent voice compared to HIV, oncology, or some of the other rare diseases. I think that it's very important for all of us to encourage our transplant population to be more vocal about these things and have an impact with the regulatory authorities when they can. I mean, you can see how much money and resources are developed in cancer when you say the C word, but yet our morbidity and mortality associated with post-renal transplant is just as significant, but yet we do not have those types of resources. And one of those things is the patient voice. And I think that there have been recently, and some groups have been established for a while, groups that are attempting to organize and empower the patient voice. And I think that I can only encourage those groups and encourage them to interact with us as societies and us as care providers, again, to not only just elucidate the problem, but come up with a way to measure the problem that's going to have a regulatory impact that improves their life.
Thank you. I totally agree. Having a registry also gives us research data and to back up any interventions that we may come up with. Another question, terrific presentation, Dr. Alloway. Do you believe we should expect limitations from PROMs when applied to populations in other countries, especially non-English speaking patients, considering PROM's application in international multi-center studies? Thanks for your talk.
Okay, the practical side of me wants to say no. The regulatory side of me and being on that aspect of it is going to say that it's going to have to be shown to be effective here. But then you struggle with, you know, our clinical trials are international trials. They're done all over the world. Now, granted, most of them are in Europe and North America, where they get their primary patient populations from. But all of those idiosyncrasies are very, very important. And maybe this is why I'm not a PRO scientist, because I don't want to get so bogged down on some of those details that we miss the whole point. But at the same time, I'm having to back out away from it some, because I recognize the regulatory rigor that has to go into this. And I'm not the FDA. I'm not a pharmaceutical company. But I just struggle because I'm used to seeing the patients, and I want something to be accomplished for them, I guess. Maybe too maternalistic.
All right, awesome. So that's, I think, all of the questions from the audience. So I'll ask one more and make sure there's no last minute questions from the audience. So if you've got something, type it in now. So I guess as you were going through your presentation, you mentioned that one of the things when the EMA came back to that first group with their thoughts on incorporating PROs was that it was difficult to assess PROs from a regulatory standpoint. Can you expand a little bit on why that is and how we as a transplant community can help overcome that?
So I think it goes back to fit for use and differentiating what happens with the disease state. You know, and sometimes this is going to be really crazy and out there, but sometimes I almost feel like, okay, if we're developing a new drug, should it be compared to a person that's on dialysis? Because that's really what we're comparing. Or did you stay on dialysis, or did you improve, we get a transplant and stay on this drug? So I think the difficulties in assessing them are what was brought up and mentioned before. There's such a dramatic impact of transplantation on the outcomes that we're measuring, and it's difficult to tease out the differences between the intervention. And you've got to show that your intervention, that's the fit for purpose. Your intervention is making the difference in what you're assessing, and what you're not measuring is not any worse. You're not causing some alternative adverse event to what you're measuring in a PRO.
All right, well, with that, we didn't receive any other questions. Thank you so much again, Dr. Alloway, for joining us this afternoon to share your thoughts on PROs with us.
AST, APCOP, and the TxPharm COP, we thank our panelists and attendees for today's session. Please remember to complete the evaluation survey and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.